Our scripture text this morning comes from the book of Philippians, Paul's letter to the church in Philippi. It's in the first chapter, and we hear verses 12 through 14. I want you to know, beloved, that what has happened to me has actually helped to spread the gospel, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to everyone else that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers and sisters have been made confident in the Lord by my imprisonment. Dare to speak the word with greater boldness and without fear. May we pray together. Gracious God, may the words of my mouth and may the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable to you, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Had the blessing in my seminary years to take a preaching class from Fred Craddock. One of the things that Craddock was most known for was narrative preaching and trying to uncover the story within the story. One of the ways he described in that preaching class how we think about texts, and more importantly, how we think about our life, was this imagery. Because most of us walk along the ground and we find a rock on the ground, pick up that rock off the ground, think we found a beautiful rock, and think we've got a nice memory of some experience we've had on that hike or walk. We go back to the house, we place that rock on a counter and remember that experience. When all along, had we really paid attention and dug deeper, that little rock we saw on the ground was nothing to sniff at, because had we dug down, we would have discovered there was a diamond mine down below the surface of the ground. How often we quickly want the quick response, the quick fix, the easy answer. And Craddock reminds us that it takes discernment and depth to find the most significant parts of our faith and life, not only for ourselves, but for our life together. I started last week thinking about prison letters. I preached on the letter of Philemon last week. And this week, one of the prison letters we have in the New Testament is the letter to the church in Philippi. This particular letter is interesting to me. This letter written to Philippi is really kind of the feel-good letter of all the letters that Paul wrote. Philippi ended up being the one community that seemed to get what it meant to live the gospel and be the church. If you were to read the first 11 verses of chapter 1 before I picked up in verse 12, you would find this glowing, prayerful language of how thankful Paul is for the church. He's praying for them all the time, thankful for all their good works. And you go through the letter, he's telling them to press on to the goal that God has before them. Rejoice in the Lord, and again I say rejoice. He gives thanks for their generosity and their gifts. He is glowing with affection for the things the church has already done. But one of the things we discover is that Paul has been imprisoned, and there is a sense of urgency on Paul's part to write to Philippi. He feels as though they need words of encouragement, words of bolstering of who they are as a community and the impact they can have with the people they are called to serve in their local community. Paul's impact was from afar, as a scribe, as a letter writer from prison, seeking to make a difference in a community far from where he was. The encouragement could not have come to a better community. I had the fortune in 2010 of traveling to the ancient city of Philippi when I made a trek to go through the steps of Paul's second missionary journey that went through Macedonia and Greece. And the location of the city of Philippi in the first century was significant. And we can look in the back of our Bible, look at the Bible map, and find where Philippi is and not really think much about its location on the biblical map. But it was at a critical juncture in terms of the Roman Empire, in terms of a trade route, in terms of being a crossroads of many cultures and people, it would have been easy for Philippi's voice of the gospel to be lost in the midst of that multitude of cultures and experiences. I'm guessing Paul felt the need to write that letter and to give them words of encouragement. The simple phrase of speak with boldness and without fear. Be proud of who you are, what you represent, and what you are called to proclaim to the community you're called to serve. Speak with boldness. Do not hold back. Let fear subside. How often we can let fear override what we know to be true and the right thing to do, when boldness is the very trait we are called to live out in our Christian faith. As I've thought of modern day, or at least more recent day, people that were imprisoned, I thought of the 20th century person of Nelson Mandela, an activist during the period of apartheid. He was arrested in 1962 and put in prison. One of the things he had never imagined would happen to his life was how long he would be in prison. It was not until 1990 that he was released. Almost 27 and a half years of being in prison. Multiple prisons, being moved from one prison to another. At least 4 prisons he was in during that 27-year period. But one of his lasting legacies was his letter writing. You can find books on Nelson Mandela, and there is one book that has collected at least 255 letters that Nelson Mandela wrote while in prison. In no way was exhaustive of the letters that he wrote. And the letters that you find in that book are wide in their breadth of who the audience was. He wrote intimate letters to his wife and to his 5 children. He wrote letters to his friends. He wrote letters to those that were acquainted with his cause of justice. And each one of those letters was a word of encouragement to those who needed it the most. Nelson Mandela wrote in one of his letters, he says, "The power of the pen can move someone from tragedy to hope and victory." The power of a pen can move someone to victory and hope. When we think of letter writing today, we don't think much of its power. But the spoken word and the written words matter. He was not afraid in his imprisonment to be bold, to write the things he needed to write, to reach out to the people he needed to reach out to, not to bolster himself, but to bolster those who would receive that letter so they would feel more confident in who they were, how they would carry themselves, how they would share their message of love and grace to those they were called to encounter, to stand up for justice for those who needed it. And we find ourselves here in the 21st century, in June of 2020. And St. Andrew Christian Church finds itself as a predominantly white congregation trying to find its place in the midst of racial unrest. And what is our role? How should we be involved? Our inclination is to lead, to fix, to resolve. But I think we can take a cue from Nelson Mandela. We can take a cue from Paul that our role is not necessarily being in the lead, but being in a place of support and encouragement to those that are leading the way. Maybe in this day and time, we need to be listening to our black leaders with racial strife and bolstering their message. That our place of significance is standing with, not leading for. listening to those voices and allowing those voices to be more strongly heard in the community in which we live. How easy it is for us to simply pick up the rocks of the troubles that we see and think we can just pick up that rock and solve whatever it is around us. When times like this call us to dig deeper, to find the true jewels and the wisdom that's down with discerning and learning and listening and figuring out, walking with and standing beside, and maybe letting our voices be more silent and letting the right voices be louder. So maybe the power of our pen is allowing other people's pens and words to be the words that need to be heard. Challenging times. Trying to figure out our place in the world. Knowing that as Paul wrote to the church in Philippi, as proud as he was of the church, there was still so much more work to be done. And the same is true for us. This church has been in existence for 29 years and a few months. Essentially, we've only just begun the work of justice, the work of unconditional love, the work of welcoming, the work of hospitality. Maybe it would do us some good to read some letters from imprisonment. Read some letters and words of those who have been voiceless for so long. Not only will those words educate us, but it will allow us to support the very people that need the greatest support and encouragement along the way. Speak with boldness, we can say. Do not carry yourself with fear. When we stand behind those that need their voices to be the loudest, how important it is for them to know that those standing behind them are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Then their voices will even be more impactful in the communities we are called to transform. It's time to dig deep. It's time to find the diamonds. And it's time to let the right voices rise to the occasion. From our own perspective of social distancing, in our hearts, we already know what we are called to do. We are simply just reminded to do it. Amen.